going to start by asking you 3 questions. And all I'm asking you to do is to make a mental note if any of these questions resonate with you. Who of you hope to live a healthy, fulfilling, and meaningful life? Who of you see the many challenges in the world and want to be part of making a difference? And following on from that, in the process of being or trying to be part of this change, have you ever felt diminished, overwhelmed, powerless, or perhaps jaded or burnt out? So these are the questions that I've been working with on a personal level for the past 2 years, and which I've been fortunate enough to research as part of my Master's in Sustainability Leadership. But before we go any further, I want you to brace yourselves. I am about to share with you my roller coaster ride of trying to engage with a pretty tough global problem. But more than that, I want to share with you the liberation that I've experienced by embracing the ride with all its ups and downs. I'm aware that many people experience a similar roller coaster when they try to tackle the tough problems of our time, which is why I believe this is a story worth sharing. Picture it. It is New Year's Eve 2010. The afternoon light is fading. A group of us are making our way down to the beach to watch the sun slip into the ocean, the last sunset of the year. I wind my way through the dunes with Al, one of my closest friends, and I can see he's full of the joys of life. He's whistling, and he's got a spring in his step, and I wish with all my heart that I could share the joy of the moment with him. But I can't. I try and have a normal conversation with him, one befitting the celebratory atmosphere of the moment. But I can't stop thinking about an issue that's been eating away at me for the past few months since I started my master's. During one of my first lectures, I heard facts about climate change that really shocked me. In that moment, I realized that we are at a defining moment in human history, that the actions that we take over the next few years to curb our greenhouse gas emissions will determine whether we live in a tolerable world or struggle for survival in an increasingly hostile one. And it is this burden of knowledge that I carry with me to the beach. And yet, when I look around me, no one seems to share the same sense of urgency. In fact, most people seem to show no concern whatsoever. I feel desperate, helpless, and very alone. This experience shook me to the core. I realized with a shock that in my attempt to face the issues of climate change head-on, I had become a fraction of the person that I could and needed to be. My well-being had suffered, my confidence in my ability to effect change was at an all-time low, and it had left me estranged from the people I love the most. And yet, even as I landed with a thud at the bottom of that pit of despair, I knew there had to be another way. There had to be a way of facing the tough realities in the world head-on without being diminished in the process. And so began a personal exploration which essentially has been about learning how to fly. So let me tell you a little bit about my master's research. I initially decided to focus on the Transition Town movement, which is a social movement focusing on localized responses to some of the big global issues facing us. And the reason why I decided to focus on them is that they seem to be grappling with similar questions. I was deeply inspired by a passage that I read in the Transition Handbook, which was written in 2008. In it, Rob Hopkins, founder of the movement, recounts his experience of walking into a hall teeming with people who had gathered for one of the first Transition Town events in around 2006. And this is what he said. Surely, when we think about peak oil and climate change, we should feel horrified, afraid, overwhelmed. Yet here was a room full of people who were positively elated, yet were also looking at the twin challenges of peak oil and climate change square in the face. What might environmental campaigning look like if it strove to generate the sense of elation rather than the guilt, anger, and horror that most campaigning evokes? What might it look like if it strove to inspire, enthuse, and focus on possibilities rather than probabilities? As my research began to unfold, I recalled that at its core, this was a personal exploration about learning how I might be able to do things differently, and by extension, how what I learn might be helpful for others who are grappling with similar questions. The research therefore became less and less about the transition town movement and more about the personal insights I was to gain into learning how to fly. A few months ago, I began to drown in a sea of epiphanies. There were so many amazing insights that were emerging from my research, but they didn't hang together. My anxiety levels began to rise as I was a few weeks away from having to give my preliminary findings at a conference, and I had no idea how to draw these thoughts together. It was in this state of mild panic that something began to dawn on me. I realized that this sense of discomfort was a very familiar feeling, a feeling that I'd had many times during my research process, whether it had to do with the emotional distress that I experienced of trying to engage with the issue of climate change, or the uncertainty or confusion around what to do next in my research. The other interesting thing that I noticed is that these uncomfortable moments were always interspersed with moments of great relief, where I felt like I'd surfaced and could breathe again. And the other interesting thing that I noticed is that whenever I emerged from the depths of one of these uncomfortable experiences, I always felt more empowered and one step closer to the answers I was seeking. I've made a drawing of what these inner ups and downs look like for me, and visualizing it in this way helped me see a few things that I hadn't seen before. And the first is this beautiful rhythmical movement between the ups and the downs, the highs and the lows, almost like the in-breath and the out-breath. And the other interesting thing that I noticed is that my intentions were almost like a compass bearing that were keeping me moving towards my desired destination, but that the journey itself is a winding one. As I mused on this pattern, it began to dawn on me that this inner process is reflective not only of my personal journey, but lies at the core of the questions I'm asking. Many of us try to live our lives above the line, hoping to avoid these uncomfortable places. But surely these down places are an inevitable part of dealing with tough problems like climate change. Climate change is deeply distressing, so there will always be a gravity and a weightiness to the issue that cannot, and I would argue, should not be ignored. Climate change is by its very nature complex. It's politically, economically, environmentally, socially, psychologically complex, you name it. And this complexity is in itself deeply uncomfortable because there are no easy answers. Now, this sounds like bad news, doesn't it? And yet, the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that these down spaces are not only inevitable, but that they are essential stages on the journey of learning how to tackle tough problems. Let's, for a moment, look at the issue of the inevitable weightiness of climate change. One implication is that we need to learn to deal with the likely emotional distress that surfaces. The despair, the pain, the loss, the grief. This was a very clear message that most of the people that I spoke with during my research mentioned to me, and it's also something that people like Joanna Macy have been working with for a very long time. The importance of going to that inner pain rather than suppressing it. And contrary to the common held belief that these feelings will drown us, when we go there skillfully, it has been shown that there are enormous gifts awaiting us. As the poet Rainer Maria Rilke expresses so beautifully, our greatest fears are like dragons guarding our greatest treasure. Let's now turn our attention to the complexity of climate change. Now, I've already mentioned to you that there are no easy answers to climate change. And it's been shown that when we try and apply a seemingly simple solution on a complex and interconnected system without understanding that complexity, it is likely to lead to disastrous results. Take DDT as just one example. Once thought to be a miracle pesticide, it was eventually banned in the US because it was indirectly decimating bird communities by thinning their eggshells so that their eggs would break during incubation. A seemingly simple solution applied to a complex system. Now, if it's not a good idea to apply simple solutions to complex systems, What then are our options? Most of us know that we need to be doing things differently, that the way in which we've been tackling the issues up until this point has, for the most part, not worked, and in some cases has made things worse. One implication is that we need to stop doing what we usually do. And what better way to do this than by admitting that we don't have all or even any of the answers? To be willing to sit in the uncomfortable reality of uncertainty and not knowing without immediately grasping for a way out. Trusting that if we sit in the fire for long enough, something new can and will emerge. For me, this inevitable and essential movements between the highs and the lows, the ups and the downs within me, has by itself changed me. I think many of us judge ourselves when we fall or find ourselves teetering at the edge of our inner pits of despair, or fear that others will judge us. And yet it's becoming clear to me that these down spaces are as important as the ups. And that instead of dreading or fearing them, we need to be mindful only of where we get stuck. And notice that the stuckness can happen anywhere along the process, not just in the down spaces. So, for example, if we get stuck above the line for too long, it is possible that we will lose our connection with what I believe is one of the greatest resources available to us as human beings in tackling tough problems like climate change. And that is our capacity for empathy and compassion. But for those of us like me, who tend to sink, to get swamped by the gravity of it all, there are a number of things that I have learned that help us from getting stuck down here. And the first is to remember to celebrate and to cultivate gratitude. The second is to take good care of ourselves on all levels. And importantly, this includes taking regular time out, especially when things get gloomy or overwhelming. A surf, a walk, whatever feeds your soul. And finally, letting go of attachment to outcome. Doing what we can in the knowledge that the outcome may not be the one that we hope for. Now, this is something that some people have said is a very difficult thing to do. For me, it was remarkably easy when I realized I would be able to handle the emotional pain of such an outcome. And personally, learning how to let go has been my greatest liberation. Through this research journey, I have discovered that not only do we need to do things differently, we need to be different in the world, if the world is to be different. And for me, this means being present, centered, and grounded, yet nimble, agile, and adaptable. Developing the ability to respond appropriately to whatever is moving towards us, around us, through us, and within us. I'm only at the beginning of this journey, but I feel like I've taken flight. I am different to how I was that fateful evening on the beach. I am now able to face the issues in the world head on without being diminished by them. I still feel grief and pain and despair, but they no longer crush me. Instead, I am able to feel them while at the same time being able to access enormous joy and gratitude for the blessings of life. By way of example, picture it. It is New Year's Eve 2011. The afternoon light is fading. This time, we're in the mountains. This time, I am soaking in the beauty of the place with my whole being, feeling deeply blessed to be sharing and celebrating these precious moments with those I love the most. I do not claim that what I have shared here is the definitive answer to the questions that I'm asking about how we can face the issues in the world head on and flourish at the same time. But they are my answer, or at least the beginnings of one, and it is my sense that what I've shared here with you today may be of some relevance to those of you who are grappling with similar questions. Remember, our greatest fears are like dragons guarding our greatest treasure. Thank you.